It's,
Quite hateful something.
yeah, of course, yeah. This is yours, by the way. Just okay. Bon, ça va, alors tout le monde parle français ici, c'est ça, non? Non? Más o menos, okay.
Maybe we will begin.
Plus ou moins.
But I'm afraid it's going to be in English. So, welcome everybody, and Ramadan Mubarak, for whom that's an apt greeting. And in fact, the topic for the seminar today actually resonates with that a little. I'm very pleased to have Professor Olivier Esteves from the University of Lille today. Olivier is a professor in English and a member of CERAPS. I think you'd say that rather than CRAPS, which is a joint research unit mainly specializing in political science. So you straddle across the humanities and social sciences. And you work on immigration, ethnicity, discrimination in Great Britain, with a growing interest in the United States. Some of your books, Olivier, are From Invisibility to Islamophobia, British Muslims, 1945 to 2010. That came out with a French publisher. But is it in English or in French?
No, it's in French. No, it's in French. It's by Presse de Sciences Po.
Yep. But we also have books in English. You have the desegregation of English schools, busing, race, and urban space, the 1960s to the 1980s with Manchester University Press, which won a research prize, I see.
Yeah.
Congratulations. And you have an edited book with Stéphane Poirion.
Yep.
The Lives and Afterlives of Enoch Powell, the Undying Political Animal. Gosh, that sounds frightening. And you've also brought out a collection, which I'm surprised that a French scholar had to do this, a collection of letters of support to Enoch Powell when he made his famous River the Blood speech. So these are letters from 1968-69, published by Routledge, called Inside the Black Box of White Backlash. And that brings us then to the talk today, which is based on a new book just out a couple of months ago with Polity Press called France, You Love It But Leave It, The Silent Flight of French Muslims. So thank you very much for coming to give us this talk, and we're looking forward to it. So over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tariq, and thanks a lot, John, for the very kind invitation. Obviously, when you invited me months ago, or when I partly invited myself, there was no way such foul weather could be anticipated. So I just arrived in Bristol, and I get weather which is more evocative of, I don't know, Aberdeen or something. But anyway, so I'm very, very happy to be in Bristol. I was, I think I've been twice to Bristol, but the last time must have been like 20 years ago or so. So it makes you feel very old. The book that Tariq mentioned was actually published in the French, with a French mainstream press called Le Seuil. And the title in French is La France, tu l'aimes mais tu la quittes, enquête sur la diaspora française musulmane, which then I translated into English. I was very proud of having done, I think, a great job until I received the copy from Polity Press with hundreds of things that were not working. So it made me realize that I'm much more a native speaker of French than anything else. But anyway, and the book itself in France has made a great deal of noise for 2 or 3 reasons. One being that it's supposed to be targeted at a sort of a mainstream readership. It's fairly free of jargon. The title, I think, was very, very catchy, and it resonated with many people that we actually talked to, as I will say in just a few minutes. And the other thing I think is the, the circumstances, under which the book itself was published, and the fact, and this is something that obviously we need to discuss today, even though we might discuss it quite briefly, is that the book was actually co-authored by 3 people who are clearly non-Muslims. And so we spend 3 or 4 pages in the introduction explaining why, as such, it was actually 3 people that are non-Muslims who actually co-authored this book. The debate on racism, and in particular on Islamophobia in France, is so passionate, it's so angry, it's so tense that it's virtually impossible for anyone who is self-identifying Muslim to publish that kind of research without plenty of media, plenty of politicians saying, well, you say this because you exaggerate the issue, because you're a Muslim yourself. And so, and regarding the who published the book, as non-Muslims, beyond, academic debates about positionality and all this, the public at large was very happy that it was actually 3 non-Muslims who published the book. Also, the interviewees that we talked to, in London, Birmingham, also in Montreal and in Toronto, Ottawa, in Canada. I then revisited a few of the interviewees that we had, and they were delighted. They were actually saying, yeah, it is a good thing that non-Muslims are publishing this book. Muslim colleagues, though, took a different view. I think in terms of the academic debate, it's been very markedly different, I would say. But yeah, I'm very happy to discuss this further after my talk. Can I speak for, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, or
40, 45?
Okay, that's cool. So yeah, so this is the book that I have here. The book cover is much more I would say catchy in the English language than in the French language. Originally, it's a multidisciplinary team that we have with approximately 10 people from various walks of academic life. And then I will try to say a few words about the vocabulary that we mobilize to refer to the group that we are that we are analyzing. We had major issues with should we call these people expats? Should we call these people exiles? Should we call these people refugees from French secularism? And there's no definite, there's no perfect vocabulary, depending on whether the people felt that they had to leave France because they were discriminated against and couldn't find a job because they were wearing a hijab, for instance. Clearly, these people would fall under the category of exile, as opposed to a substantial minority of people that we talked to who actually left France for mostly professional reasons. They already had, decent jobs in France, and they went to the UK to learn some English, or they wanted to, a more sort of dynamic job market. In that case, of course, the word exile doesn't apply. I think a lot of the people that we talk to, unless they are politicized to the left, and unless they studied social sciences, or they will readily refer to themselves as expats. In other words, there's a way in which expat seems to be the lingua franca, the sort of common denominator for many of those people, at least in the way they present themselves. Okay, and this is also a way to sort of an implicit way for them to realize the extent of their upward mobility outside of France. Of course, expat is a massively post-colonial, neo-colonial kind of word. And I remember an article in the Guardian by a black, I think, writer, a black woman from Ghana or something. The title was quite catchy. Why are those white British called expats, whereas we are seen as immigrants? That kind of thing. So obviously, the majority of the people that we talk to, they naturally refer to themselves as expats, unless they are quite politicized to the left. They have been studying social science, in which case they're quite wary with the concept of expat. I remember that we had a discussion with Abdelali Hajat. Do you know this colleague, Abdelali Hajat? Okay, he's now a professor of sociology at ULB in Brussels. And he's actually an academic who felt that in order to study Islamophobia in France, it was probably a better idea to live outside of France. So we had a chat with Abdelali about our book project, and he was quite reluctant to be part of it because he said, "Well, I'm your object, you know." So he mentioned the idea of double exile. He said, "Well, quite a few of us, our family itinerary." Partakes of a kind of double exile thing because our parents or grandparents left Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and then we, the offspring, have felt that we have had to leave France. Okay, and obviously one of the major issues we had was to quantify the number of French people who are Muslims and who have left France. There are plenty of reasons why this figure is actually completely unquantifiable. And interestingly, for quite a few conservative media and conservative politicians who heard of the book, one of the things they were complaining about was, well, you can't even turn up with a figure, this is not serious research. So we had to spend a great deal of time saying, well, it's impossible to tell for plenty of reasons. One reason being that in France, we don't have ethnic and religious statistics. And you can't only base the number of Muslims on, things like first names or family names, because of the sheer number of converts. We talked to quite a few converts, as we'll see in the next few minutes. Okay, so originally what we did was that we published a call for respondents with Mediapart. You know Mediapart? No? Those of you that are French, I'm sure you know, but those of you that are not, you probably don't know what it is. So Mediapart is now the third newspaper in France. It's completely online, right? It's totally online. And it has unearthed, it has revealed over the past 15 years, plenty of major political scandals, blah, 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 you name it. It's one of the few media outlets, it's the most important, the most influential media outlet that really combats Islamophobia, right? And says it. So we had a call for respondents published with Mediapart, and we didn't really know what to expect with this until 2 or 3 days later, that gentleman, Mohamed, there are two, for the record, in France, there are two Marwan Mohameds, right? There's one who is a sociologist. He published his autobiography a few weeks ago, which is a great book with plenty of football metaphors, and it's making a lot of noise. This is the other Marwan Mohamed, who was educated as a statistician, and then he campaigned against Islamophobia. He created CCIF, which was then disbanded by the French government. He's a very high-profile anti-racist activist in France, anti-Islamophobia activist. And 1 or 2 days after we had our call for respondents being published, he actually tweeted it. And on the next day, we received hundreds of emails, or people were starting to fill in the questionnaire, and so we felt that we had touched something. We had really found something very, very big. Okay, we had been in discussion with Marwan Mohamed, the anti-racist activist. If I was giving this talk in France, I would probably hesitate to say this. It's not that he's a friend, but we had a few explanations with him, a few chats, and obviously he was also quite helpful. Okay, and so basically what we did was that we were inviting people to participate, in the sense of fitting in a questionnaire with 37 or 38 questions, and then the very last question was, if you want to go further, give us your email, and then a member of our team will contact you, and we'll organize a Zoom biographical interview of 1 hour, 2 hours. The longest ones took about something like 4 hours. But by and large, they were between 1 hour, 1.5 hour interviews. Okay, it was with Zoom for plenty of reasons. The French university system doesn't have any money, so obviously there was no way we would go to Canada, to Australia, to Dubai, and carry out these interviews. Obviously, there's also carbon emission, which is involved. And obviously, many of the interviews we held were during COVID or just in the wake of COVID. So these are things that made, interviewing people, with face-to-face interviews just completely unthinkable. Clearly, we have a quantitative side, a quantitative, section of our work, which is in the book, basically chapter 1 with graphs, statistics, you name it. In chapter 1, we also try and quote from the many interviews that we had in order to make chapter 1 not too tough to read, and it's very strategic because this is chapter 1. And so we have also a qualitative, dimension to our study with 144 interviews for the English version, which is published by Polity Press, because we tried to update a few of our data. We had second interviews with people who live in the United States. We asked them questions about the re-election of Donald Trump. We asked a few questions to the people that live in Britain about the racist riots that took place in the summer of 2024, that sort of thing. We also talked about Palestine, obviously. We had second interviews with one or two people that live in Germany, where it's almost forbidden to demonstrate, against the Israeli policies in Palestine, and as opposed to Ireland, where, it's very welcome for obvious reasons. Okay, so we have everything in there, but the point that I would like to make, which I find important, is that there is a selection bias to our study, which, the fact that it was actually Mohamed who tweeted our call for respondents means that we have talked mostly to people who are highly educated, people whose adherence and whose identification with Islam is quite strong, and people who tend to be politicized, to the left, okay? And so we make no bones about it. In the introduction to the book, we do acknowledge that there is a selection bias to our study. At the same time, I was one of the few in the team with Julia Talpin to hammer the point that because such research has never been made in France, we don't care whether there's a selection bias. What would be a problem would be to pretend that we are 1,000,000% objective about our study, blah blah blah. But obviously, a certain number of conservative media outlets, they battered us with this idea of selection bias. Many quantitative studies, do have a selection bias. The bottom line is to be honest about it. Okay, so I'll be very brief with many of these statistics. I can share the PowerPoint with you if you want. In the quantitative study, we have a fairly substantial majority of men as opposed to women. And this we tried as much as possible to balance with the semi-directed interviews. We tried to make sure that we would have a small majority of women. Again, I'm paranoid or something, but I was anticipating reaction from the conservative media. Like, oh yeah, they are Muslims, so it's only the guys that are speaking. They don't let their women speak, that sort of thing. So I was adamant that we should have a majority of women in the interviews. And again, for anyone who works in quantitative studies, whether Muslims or not, generally, men will fill in these questionnaires rather than women. This was corroborated by quite a few quantitative sociologists that we talked to in France. Their average age, that's very important, was 35 years old at the time of the interview, which means that many of them had already integrated the job market in France, and they had finished their studies for a few years, right? And we realized that this is something I've said to quite a few media. We do develop it, at least in the English version. We have realized that among those people, there were three types of professional careers, right? Keep in mind that their average age is 35 years old. There were careers that were prevented, what we call prevented careers. Typically, a woman wearing a hijab, right? Unless in exceptional circumstances, a highly educated French woman who wears a hijab will not find a job that suits her actual qualifications at all, right? So that's what we call the carrières empêchées, prevented careers. Then there are bridled careers, or I don't remember the English that we use to explain this. Bridled or trammeled careers. Sorry?
Curbed.
Yeah, curbed. I don't, okay, anyway, curbed careers. That means people who actually got decent jobs, right? But who realize that because they're called Mohamed or because they're called Samira, you know, somebody within the same company who arrived later, right? Who arrived, you know, more recently, and maybe doesn't perform, you know, as well as, you know, this Mohamed or Samira will get above. So typically the glass ceiling phenomenon, right? So curbed careers. And the third type of career that we have identified is what we call the carrières frustrées, frustrated careers. People who were never discriminated against, at least, you know, they're not, you know, it's not obvious in the way they verbalize their own careers. And people who at the same time say, well, you know, I climbed up the ladder within my company without that many problems, but people who feel very frustrated because of racist jokes, anti-Arab references, or it can be, you know, within the company, or when they go home, you know, they switch on the TV and they get a barrage of polemics, controversies around the hijab, around you know, around French Muslims who are sort of you know, self-ghettoizing or that kind of thing. So it can be within the company or just outside the company. And it's also quite gendered sometimes. We have a few remarkable interviews with French women who, for instance, live in the UK, who told us, well, I'm not really a Muslim. I don't identify as Muslim, but my name is Samira, and my brothers and sisters, my siblings, are all self-identifying Muslims who adhere to a faith which they practice. And I wear a skirt. I love drinking wine, or I love drinking beer. Whenever there was an aperitif or, you know, a drink within the company, some colleagues, especially male senior colleagues, will tell me, or you're not like the other ones, you know, tu es la bonne arabe, the phenomenon of the good Arab, right? And this compliment, which is personal, right, was always interpreted, and rightly so, as a collective insult, right? And this is really part of the frustrated careers that we're discussing. You know, t'es pas comme les autres, because you're wearing a skirt, you drink alcohol, you know, you are integrated, right? Those of you that don't know much about France or have never lived in France cannot imagine the social pressure to drink alcohol in France, right? In my experience, it's insane. And I love wine and I love beer, and I'm not a Muslim. So I keep telling quite a few non-Muslims in my you know, circle of friends or something that there's nothing wrong with not drinking alcohol, right? No, but it's something that is quite hard to imagine if you're not French. Sorry, I've shifted away some from these statistics. Yeah, 54% of the respondents are highly qualified. They have you know, they have done 5 years at university, right? They have so they are you know, they are like they are postgraduate. You know, they have bac plus 5, as we say in the French language. I am not sharing the statistics for the people that we did interview, right? The people that we did manage to have interviews with. I think this figure for the people that we had interviews with is something like 67 or 68%, which means that it clearly, you know, corroborates the fact that in order to have an interview with someone you don't know for a social science project, you have to have the, you know, the social and the cultural capital, the you know, the self-confidence to participate, and therefore that figure is even higher, right? I remember that once or twice I had, this is an anecdote, but I still feel it quite telling. Once or twice I had interviews with people who clearly, you know, were not highly educated people. It was quite obvious from the first minutes, the way you speak, the accent, the kind of vocabulary you mobilize, I just felt, okay, I'm gonna have to speak differently. Okay, and then I was asking questions in a much more different way than I would have with the bulk of the people that we talk to. In terms of earnings, I'm not sure the reference to earnings is that important. It really depends on the cost of life in various cities. This is a photo of Vancouver. This is a photo of Algiers. Of course, the cost of life in Vancouver, which is meant to be one of the most expensive cities in the world, is not the same as in Algiers or as in Casablanca or you name it. Okay? Importantly, 40% or so of the people, of the respondents, had no prior contact whatsoever with their country of residence before they left, which gainsays, the tradition of what we call chain migration. You migrate, you emigrate to a place that you already know, where some of your relatives have gone. Typically the story of Irish immigration to the UK, or Irish immigration to the United States, or Italian, Sicilian immigration to the United States. Here it's different, which seems to place these people in the expat category more than in the immigrant category. Okay, wonderful. So we also asked these people questions about what defines you best, your origins. So as you can see, they could pick up 4 identity criteria. Origins is important to them, religion, hobbies and personal tastes. Nearly all of them self-identify as Muslim, and I forgot to mention this element from the previous slide. Nearly all of them are French nationals. Okay. So yeah, this is the selection bias, the element with Marwan Mohamed. For many of them, as you can see here with these statistics, Islam is important in how they make sense of their own, their individual identity. Okay, where are they? So here there's a difference between the actual, the quantitative and the qualitative study, but by and large, the UK is first in the quantitative and in the qualitative study. The Emirates, including Dubai, mostly Dubai, in fact, is second with the quantitative study, and Canada is third. And here Canada is second, the US is third, and the Emirates is actually fourth. And we have felt that it was not that easy to reach out to people who actually live in Dubai. So having interviews with people that live in Dubai hasn't been that easy. We have different explanations for this, but when we correlate different data, we have realized that the people who most actively report incidents of discrimination, incidents of microaggressions, being discriminated against quite violently on the job market, etc. Many of these people now live in the UK and in Canada, both of which are clearly experienced and labeled, described by our interviewees as countries where non-discrimination prevails, right? I'll try and say a few words about this in the next few minutes, because quite a lot of you might not agree with me on that thing. But anyway, so I think this is mostly why I think the people were very determined to talk to us, because they had stories of microaggression and discrimination back in France to describe. Okay, this is a photo of. Do you recognize that gentleman? Leonard Cohen, right? So this is in Montreal, in Canada. Okay, a lot of the people that we talk to live in Canada, and particularly in Quebec, which is francophone, as you all know, and which has a public policy of attracting francophone immigrants, right? And so clearly, they make a great effort to try to recruit francophone, highly qualified people. This is probably the most important, table or graph that we have in the book. We have it. This is the first graph that we have. reasons for leaving. Why did you leave France in the first place? We have 14 reasons altogether. People, interviewees could select 4 of them, right? And we made a tremendous effort not to sort of ghettoize these people in a collectively discriminated against category, right? We just wanted them to have the chance to say, well, I went to live in Bristol for the weather. That's a joke. I went to live in Bristol because I wanted to learn English. I wanted to create my own business. So to learn a foreign language, to enjoy a more clement climate. So that's probably people that want to go to Morocco or Algeria or Spain, maybe, to boost my standards of living, to travel and seek adventure abroad, to enjoy a multicultural environment doesn't really mean anything. You can be a non-Muslim, your first name can be Marie-Charlotte, a French white bourgeois name, and you might like to enjoy a multicultural environment the way you would, I don't know, in Toronto or Los Angeles, for instance. Of course, to live on Muslim land clearly is different from the others. And these 2 are by far the most selected. I left France to face racism and discrimination less frequently, to live my religion more peacefully. These are massive. And interestingly, to live on Muslim land doesn't seem to be a priority for many of these people, despite the fact that they are quite devout and quite religious. So a lot of them feel, and this is an interview with a guy who now teaches English and Arabic in Qatar. He left the UK, but he was based in Worcestershire for a few years. He said to us, for many of us, England is like a postmodern Abyssinia. And then he refers to, of course, the first Hijra, right? And says that England, at least to us, in the way we experience it, is like a second Abyssinia. So it's not a Muslim land, but if you are Muslim, you feel much more at peace, much more peaceful about your own religion than if you live in France. And then again, of course, some people might not agree with me, but this is not my viewpoint, but the viewpoint shared by someone that we interviewed and many people that we actually interviewed. Okay? Middle-class multiculturalism and the promotion of diversity. Just 2 or 3 things before okay, so here, these are, just let me try and explain. So obviously being English, you recognize that photo, it's the Gherkin in London. Prayer rooms, we have underlined this fact a great deal. Prayer rooms are the norm in many companies, many offices, many public offices, many places where people work. In the UK, in Canada, in the United States, obviously in Muslim majority countries, and they're frowned upon in France, and they're almost banned. They're not illegal at all, but they are banned because of this largely shared misunderstanding around French secularism, which means no religion in public space. This is not originally what French secularism means, but by dint of years and years and years of controversy, this is what most French people actually believe. So I think what was a real issue for many politicians or media in France was to say, well, once you leave France, you go to Belgium next door, you go to Switzerland, you go to the Netherlands, you go to Ireland, it's not a big deal. If there is a certain number of employees in any company that want to pray, you have a small room and people can pray and that's it, right? We have realized that in factories in England, this is something I didn't know. We had a few interviews with people who have been working in various factories. One in Leicester, there was the Drax power station in Yorkshire, a few other places too. Prayer rooms are super banal, right? And that in France sounds like completely outlandish or potentially extremist or that sort of thing. Something we don't mention in the book and something that I have realized by looking at the archives and stuff is that the huge paradox is that in the 60s and 70s, particularly in the 70s, corporate interests in France, as well as ministers, right? They were saying that it was a good thing to have prayer rooms for Muslim workers. Why? Because these people were non-nationals, they were males, they were underpaid, and so it was a good idea for the Minister of Labor, the Ministry of Labor, and for corporate interests in France to have prayer rooms ready, so that this would make workers happy, and workers would not complain about their wages or their working conditions and stuff. But then 10 years later or 20 years later, by the time the offspring of these workers were French nationals, highly educated, and they said, well, we'd like to pray, then there was this whole issue about secularism. Okay, so again, when you consider things in the longue durée, it really is quite a fascinating thing. Okay. Middle class multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is very important. Middle class also is. It's the idea that these people, although they are Muslims in public space, although they are, many of them are quite devout Muslims, they are welcome in the UK, in Canada, in the United States, because they are highly educated, because they are engineers, because they are business consultants, because they will fill in voids in the job market that are very important, and that they will generate wealth, right? So those of you that might think, well, there is a lot of Islamophobia in the UK, of course there is, but this Islamophobia doesn't target the people that we talk to, right? And this is something that is obvious from the word go, right? If your name is Mohamed, you arrive in London, you look for a job, you are highly educated. If you speak English like this, people in the UK will straight away realize that you are French. It's as easy as that, right? It's fundamental to keep that in mind. And the same situation obtains in Montreal in Canada, in Brussels in Belgium, in Geneva in Switzerland, because if you speak French the way I speak French, alors si vous, j'ai pas d'accent clairement identifiable, mais quand je parle, je fais une phrase. People, I was invited professor at Montreal twice. If I just pronounce a sentence in French, people straight away identify me as French. So the same goes for those people that go and live in Montreal or Brussels or Geneva. And again, it is super important. Very briefly, for just a few minutes that remain, this is the situation in Canada is very complex, because there's Anglophone Canada and there's Quebec, right? Quebec, to some extent, particularly with the introduction of so-called Law 21, tried to introduce secularism in public policy, and they messed up a great deal, but it's not as bad as the French, because they clearly argued with this Law 21 that secularism is about separation of church and state, right? Separation of the churches and state, and the upshot of that is neutrality of the state. Okay, so there was a law in 2004 in France which banned the wearing of religious signs for pupils, for students in high schools, right? And quite a few critics of the law said, well, it's not for the persons that actually use a public service to be neutral. It's for teachers, or it's for state public agents to be religiously neutral. Okay, Quebec does this. In other words, Law 21, however criticizable it is, still gets secularism right, in the sense that it's actually anyone who works for the state that has to be religiously neutral. I'm still quite critical of it myself, but at least they get their secularism right. Okay, we talked to approximately 10 people, 10 interviewees that we had, who lived in Quebec for like 10, 15, 18 years. And then with these polemics that made them think a great deal about France, they decided to go to Ottawa or go to Toronto. They decided to go to Anglophone Canada. This is a poster that is really quite cool, explaining this. It's a poster advertising jobs for nurses in the outskirts of Toronto. And it clearly implicitly refers to these polemics in Quebec. We don't care what's on your head, we care what's in it. Okay? And clearly a certain number of the people that we talked to, they were attracted by this, this Anglophone Canada, that again, the political DNA in France is secularism. I would say Islamophobic secularism, clearly, okay, because there was virtually no talk about secularism before there was any controversy around the hijab in 1989. This is when it started. The political DNA in Canada, by and large, is multiculturalism. Of course, it's middle-class multiculturalism, but it is multiculturalism, which is why for anyone that lives in Toronto or Vancouver or just these controversies around secularism in Quebec, they sound outlandish, clearly. Okay? Briefly, yeah, I don't have much time to discuss this, but these are photos that are reproduced with the formal agreement of the people that were interviewed, clearly. Yeah. One reason why these people are not expats is because 9 out of 10 of them, at least, they don't want to return to France. So if you are an expat, being an expat is defined in many different ways, but being an expat implies a return back home after 2, 3, 4 years. The vast majority of these people, they don't want to return home. These are statistics that were produced before the re-election of Trump, before this massive, reactionary upsurge, or during this reactionary upsurge, but before it got even worse with the re-election of Trump. But even despite that, of course, the situation in France is more and more ominous for anyone who is Muslim. So clearly, there is no collective willingness to return to France. I'd like to finish with one.
Olivier, I was just going to say, could we just at least read the slides you went across, even if you haven't got time to expand on them?
Okay, yeah, of course, yeah.
Just see them.
Yeah.
They look quite important.
Okay. Okay. Okay, hold on a minute. Yes. Yeah, this one is, yeah, cool. So let me just refer to this one. There's a bit about football, popular culture, cheese, and then Victor Hugo, much more sort of highbrow culture, right? Universal Frenchness. We have 4 sets of questions that we asked them. And I think that you're right, Tariq, particularly this slide is important because have you heard of the TNO project, Trajectoire et Origine? Okay, so the TNO project, the Trajectory and Origins project, is as close as France ever went in the production of ethnic statistics, okay? And we deliberately picked up some of the questions that they asked, okay, the INSEE and INED in France, and we asked these same questions to our set of respondents. And then we compared those data, okay? We have 4 sets of 4 questions, which are fundamental, which are, before you left France, did you feel French? Before you left France, did you feel you were perceived as French? Okay? And then we asked the question, since you have left France, do you feel French? And since you have left France, do you feel perceived as French, right? And the results are quite telling. For the first 2 questions, clearly the sense of feeling French is corroded by the feeling that these people are not perceived as French, right? And since they have left France, again, sometimes for reasons that have nothing to do with Islam, right? If you speak English like this, okay? They are perceived as French, and this boosts their sense of Frenchness, clearly. Okay? And of course, their sense of Frenchness is also massively boosted by things like nostalgia, right? Living in Canada and trying to find some cheese that is as good as in France, right? And where good cheese costs a fortune, that sort of thing. Okay, what kind of football team do you support in a country like Canada, where clearly hockey is more important than soccer? So it is very often also about things like popular culture. Okay, yeah. a lot of these people are saying things like, jamais cela n'aurait été possible en France. It would have never been possible in France to become as upwardly mobile as I have in Canada or in the United States would never have been possible in France. So again, it's something that comes to the fore with many of the people that we talk to. Okay, very good. Yeah, a lot of these people also shared. So this is part of this is what chapter 2 and chapter 3 is about. The book is largely organized on a chronological basis. Chapter 2 is about their childhood, where they grew up, what kind of experience do they share, blah, blah, blah. Chapter 3 is about the why and how of leaving France, with people saying, I was stopped and searched by the police on a regular basis. I was really fed up with it. I kept telling the cops, well, I am French, I have a French passport, that sort of thing. And so microaggressions, which were shared in many ways as so many anecdotes, right? Which is a way to euphemize, how violent the experience can be. We clearly have dozens of them, and it was quite difficult sometimes to just make a choice, to pick up this or that telling kind of anecdote. Okay, so here, yeah, microaggression and agents of the state. It's about a man who is an English teacher in Strasbourg, and he's being stopped and searched by the police. And so he says to the police, well, listen, we are colleagues. We are fonctionnaires, right? You are a state agent. I am a state agent. Okay. And the man was actually driving with his sister for the hospital because she was about to give birth to her baby. Okay. Yeah, recent escalation since 2015 and the vicious circle. The idea here is that a lot of people said things like, after 2015, after the wave of terrorist attacks, it became almost impossible to breathe in France. And there is this sense of, as we say, somatiser in the French language, to somatize, to express with your body something that you feel, in your mind, right? On parle de on dit somatiser en français. And really there was, this phrase came back on a regular basis, the idea that I couldn't breathe in France. And when I arrived in London or I arrived in New York or in Dubai, I felt that now I could breathe. Okay, and again, the 2015 wave of terrorist attacks, I think, is quite important. This man who lives in Montreal, I find this quote very interesting. We don't include it in the book because quite a few of the co-authors said that it was something like a social class stereotype, and I do agree with it. But I still think there's something interesting in what he says. He says that ultimately the fact that France is shooting itself in the foot, right, by giving many highly educated Muslims a very bad time, is like a vicious circle, because it will confirm many of the anti-Arab or anti-Muslim stereotypes that are abroad. Because those that are highly qualified, if they don't find jobs and if they feel that they are stigmatized, will leave the country, right, where there is a selection process, like in Canada. And of course, if you want to go and live in Canada, you have to have a criminal record which must be clean. Okay, so the idea of the vicious circle in this sense, I think, is quite interesting. I don't know whether I can speak anymore, but maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Exit voice loyalty tax. We have a great deal of well, I don't know, quite a few people that say things like, I'm not very political, I'm not very left-wing, or, but when I started working, to me, it was important that I should leave France because there was no way that my taxes would finance laws wearing the hijab, or that would finance police forces that are, giving a very bad time to my family, that sort of thing. So there is, of course, there is a long tradition of, civil disobedience based on the refusal to pay taxes. Think about Thoreau, think about Gandhi in India, that sort of thing. But here, it's really at sort of individual level, right? The idea being that they felt that if they stayed in France in some way, they would be accomplices to a system that they strongly disagree with. Okay, happy now? Yes. The immense majority of the people that we talk to are very satisfied with their situation outside of France. And then, yeah, the future, this is something that I talked about before Tariq said, hold on a minute, there are some slides you're leaving beside. You're leaving, yeah, I mentioned positionality already, being white, non-Muslim in writing, researching on Islamophobia and discriminations. And yeah, what interviewees say about the project itself, these are quotes in French, I'm sorry. But yeah, they were very supportive of the project, and they were very satisfied that at least they are given a voice. What we have been trying to do, even in chapter 1, is to, I mean, the book reads like a collective narrative. We have dozens and dozens of quotes, long quotes, small quotes from the various interviews that we have had. And I would like to finish very, very briefly with one reference, which is a literary reference. I don't think it's a great book, but I think it explains many things. I spent some weeks in Philadelphia, involved in another project that has nothing to do with this, and I was invited to present the project at UPenn with Osman Balkan, and Osman Balkan mentioned that novel, which clearly helps understand the itinerary of the people that we talk to. What is this book about? William Gardner Smith, The Stone Face. William Gardner Smith was an African-American novelist. He published a few novels, including this one. I don't think it's a great book in literary terms, but then again, I'm not a literary critic, but the issues that are covered by the book are very important to make sense of our interviewees and their profile. The Stone Face tells the story of an African-American young man from Philadelphia who is very badly beaten up by racist thugs in Philly, loses an eye, and decides in 1960, the scene takes place in 1960, to go to France. Like quite a few African-American intellectuals, right? At a time when African-Americans were called themselves Negroes, right? Okay? And so he arrives in Paris, and he's black, he's African-American. He arrives in Paris, and he is astounded, he is astonished that people refer to him as American. It's like he loses his color because, when he tries to speak French, he probably has a very American accent, right? And people refer to him as American because he has American habits, American culture, blah, blah, blah. And he starts realizing that Paris is like an El Dorado for him, okay? Until living in Paris, so the years are 60, 61, he starts to befriend Algerian immigrants. And those Algerian immigrants are telling, this guy, the Stone Face, that, the French state is super racist. Of course, the Algerian War of Independence is raging, okay? And in October 61, there is this very tragic event where we don't exactly know how many, but I mean, a large number of Algerian activists or nationalists, demonstrators are being thrown into the River Seine only because they are Algerians. And so the novel is really interesting in the sense that there is a lot of racism, but it's a type of racism that doesn't target people like the Stone Face, but targets Algerian immigrants instead. And so again, when you think about the people that we talk to, it's clearly there is a parallel that I think is interesting for anyone that would be reluctant to admit that the people that we have talked to, indeed, they suffer much less from Islamophobia in the UK than, say, young British people originating from Pakistan and who were born and bred in, I don't know, Bradford, Dewsbury, or certain areas in Birmingham, for instance. So again, that really needs to be taken into account. I've enjoyed talking to you. If you have any questions, just feel free.
Thank you very much.
I feel you have something.
Thank you. When we started, I'd overlooked that we have some people joining us online too. So I'd welcome you belatedly, and you'll have a chance to answer questions as well, as will people in the room. So maybe we should take this off.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, we can see them at the bottom, but it'd be good if we could see them higher.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
You could make it vertical or full screen, just so that if people put their hands up and they want to ask a question, we won't miss it.
Okay.
But in relation to the stone face novel that you've just mentioned and the phenomenon that you're talking about, and you said, look, do take it seriously. Well, actually, I take it seriously. I can share an anecdote with you. So just before I came to Bristol University, I was working at a place in London, a research institute in London. So say this is about 25 years ago. So I had a British Asian research colleague, and I came here, and a few years later, he got a job at the University of Glasgow. And he was very much, from London and Kent. And so, when we were talking, I said, so what's it like? What's your job like? What's Scotland like? What's Glasgow like? And he said, well, it's very odd. They don't think I'm Asian. They think I'm English. Now, that was 25 years ago, maybe different today, but I do understand the phenomena you're referring to. So now we have an opportunity to ask Olivier any questions on this very interesting piece of research, and quite unique. I don't think I've come across anything similar to this. So congratulations on having done it.
Yeah, again, it's a very collective project. I mean, there's no way a single, individual would have carried out, so many interviews and but yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, it is indeed so far it's unprecedented, and we had very little money to do it. So this also explains the Zoom thing.
Even better, yeah. So three of you have raised your hands. 4, that's excellent. So I'll just start from this end and then move across. But I have seen 4 of you raise your hands. So you were first.
Merci pour la présentation.
Okay.
I was curious to know what you thought the impact might be of secularism in schools, teaching secularism in a kind of secularist motif with laïcité in schools, whether that's had an impact with kind of current Islamophobia in France, and whether that's anecdotally through the people you spoke with, or kind of your sense as someone that lives in France or kind of grew up in France, presumably.
Myself?
Yeah, for you or the people that you spoke to. So yeah, I was just curious about that.
Okay, so there are many things to say. I mean, over the past few years, especially under Macron, right? Macron has a huge responsibility in this. I don't know the extent to which you're familiar with this, but before he got elected, a few months before he got elected, he said things about secularism that I agree with 1,000,000%, honestly. And then he forgot about secularism altogether, which is a good thing. The yellow vest thing happened. It was huge. The yellow vest, mobilization was huge. And then in the wake of this, there was the great national debate. He started to introduce elements about secularism and about immigration, deflecting, the blame from, trying to avoid talking about social issues and talking about identity issues. And then it became like a catechism of secularism. And it was already a catechism of secularism. What I mean by catechism is that it's virtually impossible to take critical distance from it publicly, especially if your name is Mohamed, right? So again, depending on who you are, you can or you can't take public critical distance from it. I was telling Tariq before we arrived that I'm actually working on a small book project, which is quite polemical, about secularism, about French secularism. And the question I ask is, what if we ditch the whole thing altogether? And to say this for quite a few colleagues or politicians in media is almost like saying that the earth is flat. And I'm not exaggerating. I think this is the extent of control, public control over any serious debate about secularism. What is super hypocritical about the whole debate about secularism is 2 things. First of all, if you look into the Le Monde digital archives, Le Monde is like a barometer of French public debate since 1945. You type, digital archive, you type Islam, secularism, from 1945 to 1989, the first headscarf affair, the very few hits that you will find, secularism, Islam, they're always texts that deal with Tunisia, Turkey, Egypt, countries that are not France. Ever since the first headscarf affair, it starts to be used by reference to France, and the escalation, number of hits is like every year you get hundreds and hundreds of articles. So you can very easily objectify that whenever we talk about secularism, we really talk about Islam. The Catholic heritage of France is taken for granted. The second reason why it is super hypocritical is because, as opposed to the UK, there is no there is no secular Republican school system in France, because faith schools, 95% of which are Catholic faith schools in France, they are very heavily subsidized by the state, at least 75%. So whenever we talk about secularism, we talk about schools, mostly in France. Sometimes we talk about swimming pools, sometimes we talk about hospitals, should nurses wear hijabs and stuff, but mostly we talk about the schooling system. The immense majority of the elites that govern France, including Macron, Blanquer, they were schooled in faith Catholic schools that are financed by everyone, and that that are super very generously financed by the state, and they are Catholic schools, which means that empirically there is no such thing as a separation of church and state. If you send your kid to a Catholic school in the UK, how much does it cost a year? I don't know.
Well, if it's a state-funded Catholic school, it's free.
Yeah, but I mean, if it's a private school.
Oh, well, they vary.
Yeah, well, it would be something like £10,000 or 12 or even more.
Well, a day school, do you mean, not a boarding school?
Yeah.
Well, probably be a bit more than 10,000.
Yeah. But I mean, in France, it's super cheap because it's virtually wholly financed by the state. So it's one way in which I try to answer your question. If I can try and answer it from another angle, is that I was fascinated with a few of the interviews we had with people that have been living outside of France for a very long time. People that are more or less my age or slightly older, who have been living in the UK since 1996, 1997. And so these people have experienced, did experience the first headscarf affair. And they said, well, I remember I was a teenager and it was a very big thing. We never heard about it before, blah, blah, blah. And so what they also said, and something that we don't talk about it in the book because we didn't have enough space, but we have realized that there was already wholesale banning of the headscarf on the French job market before the first headscarf affair, but it was not labeled a question of secularism. It was labeled a question of extremism or civil being I don't know, propriety or that sort of thing. So they started to use secularism in 1989 as a sort of way to make racism, respectable. Instead of being against Arabs or against Muslims, you are for secularism, clearly.
Well, I look forward to your next book then on secularism.
Sorry, Turk. 2 people in the queue online. Olivier, I'll limit your answers to yes or no. Okay.
Yes, yeah, you probably do have to be a bit shorter in your answer.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
So I'll go around the Roman anti-clockwise, but I will bring people from online as well. So you were next.
Yes.
Hello.
I had a query. See, the way that in France they deal with nationalism and identity, I think, has a big effect on what ends up being the acceptance of, say, Algerians and such. I think the combination of this, how do I put this? In Britain, in America, in Canada, you can be a hyphenated nationality. You can be Black British, you can be American British, whatever else. You can be Polish American, etc. But I don't think that's as much of a thing in France. I think they more define you by ethnically what you are, and then that in a combination of laïcité, I think, both hurts assimilation in France, like helping people feel French. I feel it kind of shoots themselves in the foot in that regard. Do you agree?
Yes, there are two sides to your query. I'll try and be as short as possible, I swear. I fully agree with the second part of your question. I'm trying to find a quote, a lengthy quote from one of the people that we talked to, who's based in California, and he says exactly this. He says, interestingly, quite a few of the people that we talked to who live in California, they say right here, but when they say right here, they mean in California, not so much in the US, right? As if California was an independent state. And the guy says, it was actually, yeah, paradoxically enough, so he lives around San Francisco, right? He's an engineer in the Silicon Valley. This was at a time when, Silicon Valley, barons were supposed to be liberal and left-wing, and before Trump's re-election. And he says, paradoxically enough, it is thanks to California that I have managed to feel totally French and Algerian. I know it may sound stupid or strange, but Americans have made me realize there is no choice to make. When I was in France, I felt like I had to make a choice between two conflicting identities, but not so anymore. I have become reconciled with France, thanks to all these years here in the US, and I promote France, which is my country. And though he says I have a 200% identity, 100% French, 1% Algerian, and this is something that has been made possible by the United States and California. In France, there is a long tradition of Republican assimilation, which means that hyphenated identities as such are really almost a swear word, but it's an abstract discourse. There's nothing about it that is empirical. It's only imposed upon from above by people who are, white, upper middle class, or bourgeois people who went to Catholic faith schools paid by everyone.
Okay, thank you. That was a better length answer. You're next.
My question kind of relates to what you were talking about. One slide that was very interesting to me is about the statistic about how many people, or the expats, or like people that left France, how many of them felt like they were more French when they left France. And I'm interested to know how many of them are residents rather than citizens and French nationals, because I personally lived in France for a little bit, and a lot of my family lives in France, but most of us are residents, but we still are culturally like very French, but not like French nationals. So I want to know if there's any statistic about that, and if there was any difference between the responses of the residents and the French nationals.
Okay, yes, it is. Let me start by referring to countries where it's going to be super obvious. People that live in Saudi Arabia, Dubai, Singapore, especially in Dubai, if they lose their jobs, they might have to return to France or to go to another country in the next month, or in other words, taking root in these countries is impossible, right? And obviously, to become a citizen of many of these countries is virtually, impossible. Citizenship is based on ethnicity to a large extent, and is very, very closed. So we talked to quite a few people. We haven't produced statistics about have you become a citizen in your country of residence. We thought about it, but we had to remove that question because the questionnaire would have been too long. To fill in the whole questionnaire took between 15 and 20 minutes. So we had to exclude that question. Also because depending on where they live, the answers will be very different. So this is something that we did in the interviews, and we had quite a few interesting interviews with people that became US citizens, became Canadian citizens, or UK citizens. Most of these people have become, if they have become UK citizens, it is mostly for pragmatic reasons, I think. Having, I don't know, just for mostly pragmatic reasons. What I find interesting too is that, that immigrants in France cannot vote at elections, even local elections. This was a long ago promise by François Mitterrand that never materialized. There is no debate about this today, obviously. And the fascinating thing is that some of the people that we talked to, they said, well, I live in London. Here, I'm a foreigner, but I can vote at local elections. My parents, they have lived in France for 40 years, being taxpayers, they cannot even vote. So I'm not answering your question, but it's this whole thing about citizenship and the right to vote that I think, illuminates our project quite interestingly, I think.
Okay, I'll take one more from the room and then I'll come back to the room later, but then we'll bring in some people online. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Well, thank you for your talk. I thought it was brilliant. One thing, just as an aside, the accent point I thought was so important because I just resonated with my experience of spending a year in Sweden and finding that during my PhD and finding that the kind of PhD peers I met over there, they were like, "Oh, that would be so great to meet you. Oh, you speak Oxford English, or you speak BC English." And they love my English accent, and they were like, one of my friends who was more honest was like, well, we think there's kind of two kinds of English people, basically. The ones who are kind of speak Oxford English, and the ones who are football hooligans. I mean, I consider myself British anyway, but when I went there, I was received so warmly because of my accent, and it was great. I nearly got a job there. I would have gone, but equally, it's a country that has this problem where the migrants, Sweden, children of migrants do not get jobs, and there's a kind of parallel kind of these application studies where you apply if you're called Mohamed and you apply if you're called Anderson, and your chance of getting a job in Sweden as a Swedish-born minority is depressingly low. So there's that. But my kind of other comments are about whether you have data or whether there is data on non-white, non-Muslim people leaving France. So how much is the religion factor, or whether you have other Black French people leaving France because of racism? And also just interesting, I think it's the way that Christianity functions as a kind of passive feature of British life. I'm sure Tarek, and I've seen posts on Facebook by my Facebook friends who I don't know very well, talking about Ramadan and talking about Lent and drawing parallels between Ramadan and Lent, and these, white English people, and so just how we have this kind of people who are kind of pro-Christian or somehow define themselves as Christian, you can sort of get Ramadan. It's not. I've never seen the parallel before, except today. But if you have some sort of Christian ideals, you might then appreciate other religious ideals. But yeah, so that was that.
The reason you've seen it for the first time is because this is probably the first time that the start of Ramadan and Lent coincide. Ramadan. Based on a lunar calendar, so it's continually moved.
Yeah, I thought about it recently, actually, this coincidence that's happens every 12 years, I suppose. Okay, approximately. So yeah, thanks a lot for the nice, the kind words. So yeah, I talked about accents. I think another thing that needs to be taken into account in Francophone environments outside of France is vocabulary. Is what kind of vocabulary, what kind of accent and what kind of vocabulary you mobilize. I don't know who's French here, so I could tell that there was one. Okay, just okay. Okay. We talked to an engineering to a computing engineer who's from the Comoros, right? So he's Black and Muslim, and he's from a housing estate area outside of Paris, and he has this very sort of banlieue accent, which is discriminated against on the job market, and uses vocabulary that is associated with the area where he grew up. And he says that in this large open space in Montreal, he keeps saying "wesh, c'est abusé." And if he says to us, if I said that in France, in any company, they would think of me as a thug, right? And they would, they would look down upon me, and I would be stigmatized for it. But in Montreal, when I say this, people find it fun. People find it exotic. People will have a laugh with me. They will think, okay, it's one of those Frenchmen. And so I just found this fascinating because it's the idea that they don't get that that kind of vocabulary is associated with being from a poor, underprivileged area in France. And again, it's not only about accent, but also about vocabulary. Regarding other, so clearly it's a very good question. There is more and more empirical evidence of Jewish people that actually leave France for reasons of anti-Semitism. And also because in certain places in France, there is this, they also feel that France is not too keen on ethnic and religious diversity in general. Although, in terms of the education system, the Jewish schools, of which there are quite a few in France, the French state lets them do whatever they want because they're too afraid of being labeled as anti-Semitic. That's a fact. Okay, so you don't get this sort of state racism that does affect Muslims to a large extent. So I'm coordinating a journal with a few colleagues, well, Julien Talpin et Alice Picard, which is partly about this. And we have an article by a historian that deals with the history of Israel and the Jews in France, who has interviewed quite a few Jews that left France, gone to Israel. So these guys, they're happier to actually go to a country that is at war rather than live in France. But the quantitative studies that we have of that suggest that approximately 40% of those people ultimately return to France. We can imagine why.
Okay, thank you. So I'll return to the room for questions, take your questions in a moment, but...
This is just an aside, but I have plenty of time. I don't know if to
some people would like to have a drink, and they can talk to you
exactly
with a drink. And perhaps, given what you were saying about wine earlier, perhaps you'd be happier too. But anyway, can we have?
You can do the chat there, or I can read it to you, whichever you prefer. So just
should I?
Open the chat, and then you can.
Oh yeah, sorry. There's the chat room there.
And then the first one from Sarah.
Oh yeah, so the question by Sarah is, thank you, okay, blah, blah. Would you be able to speak a bit more about how participants' narratives differed by gender? So yeah, there clearly is a gender dimension which is illustrated in France through the hijab, right? So I was dealing with a publisher, which is Le Seuil. Le Seuil is a big mainstream publisher where our editor, the people that we worked with the publisher. So we struggled with how should we structure the book. They gave us some help, and we realized that we could have had a whole chapter on the hijab, right? So emphasizing indeed how central that issue is. Sarah, I also illustrated this gender dimension with things like the good Arab woman, right? Oh yeah, you're not like the others. You wear a skirt, you drink alcohol with us, and you're not going to get married with one of those Algerian fundamentalists. So these are, clearly, narratives, personal stories that were shared with us, and also, and what was also shared was the fact that gender dynamics on the job market sometimes differ radically in different countries, right? Like we talked to a woman who lives and works in Amsterdam, and she was saying that when she arrived there after a few weeks working in her new company in Amsterdam, after she had been born and bred in France and grew up there and worked in France. She was saying that in France on the job market, her male colleagues would never talk about their families. They would never talk about their kids, their wives, and she always felt that they were single, right? And that as single, they were like on the hunt, okay? But with Dutch colleagues, she said that they would talk very, very openly about their family, their kids, blah blah. And that woman, she worked as I don't know whether you would call this a model or. She worked for perfume companies in France and
demonstrator.
But I mean she was very she was very good looking, and and so it feels that you know, the gender dynamics on the job market, and it's got nothing to do with this, with Islam as such, right? And so what we list on the on chapter 4 in the book are quite a few reasons why many of these people, they are quite peaceful and they're quite happy in their new job environment outside of France for plenty of reasons that have nothing to do with Islam. And of course, sometimes there are negative things. People have told us, well, it's insane how in the United States you have so few paid holidays when compared with France, you know, that sort of thing. Okay, so the next question by Seren, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. Was their passport privilege a factor of their successful integration into the UK or Canadian system, or was there ever an acknowledgement of it, in the sense that they had French passports and would be seen French, but maybe Muslims coming from the global south had different experiences in the same system? Yeah, clearly. So this is a very good point. Passport privilege, I think, would be more obvious with places such as Dubai, for instance, with places that are Muslim majority countries in the global south. We have a colleague in France whose name is Amélie Le Renard, so maybe I don't have time to share this on the
you're right.
Yeah. So Amélie Le Renard, she's now Saba Le Renard. She has a book on being French in Dubai, which was translated into English and published with Stanford University Press. And it's she talks a lot about passport privilege and the way the job market is very neatly, very ruthlessly structured, racially structured in Dubai, with Anglophone white people being at the very top, people from the US, from Canada, from the UK, and then other Europeans, particularly in Northern Europe, being immediately below, French people being immediately below. And then if you have a French passport, of course, in many of these places, you are very clearly privileged. Let me just try and finish my answer, if I'm not too long, by saying that we have also talked to people like a nurse, for instance, a nurse from the city of Nice, who trained and who worked as a nurse. She went to live in Qatar with her husband, who is a teacher, and in Qatar she couldn't work as a nurse because nurses are supposed to be Filipinos. So she had to train as a teacher, right? And it was interesting the way she faced racism, but a form of racism that didn't really target her as such, right? Which is part of this story about passport privilege, really. Okay.
Okay, thank you. We can come back to the room. So yes, thank you for being so patient. And then Margaret, you can be next.
Merci beaucoup déjà.
Okay.
So it's really interesting because I'm working in Canada as a researcher, and we did a study on French students in Canada.
Okay.
And yeah, and I think we're trying to like look at the diversity of profiles as well. And I think the religion aspect was not as well represented as we would have liked. I think just selection.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, I think it made us think a lot about the intersection between nationality privilege and also racism and immigration, because nationality privilege maybe in Canada would take over and feel like make students feel like they were more integrated and more accepted because being Black and being an immigrant maybe came after. But then they would also kind of notice subtle racism or anti-immigrant sentiment, and so it's a very complex situation. And I was wondering if you had encountered like situations like this that are so complex because there's so many links, so many intersections that completely change the experience of people.
Okay, so one thing I didn't mention about Canada, and that's I would have liked to investigate this much further, is we try and argue in the book that to compare Islamophobia in Canada and in France does make sense because you compare the same form of racism in two distinct polities. So it does make sense. But at the same time, if you do this, it's like you compare apples and oranges. Why? Because the first form of post-colonial racism that exists in France is Islamophobia. There is a strong post-colonial dimension in this that we have barely talked about, but clearly it is there, right? But whereas the first form of post-colonial racism that exists in Canada is against the First Nation peoples. So is France doing better or worse with its Muslims than Canada is doing with its First Nation peoples? There is no answer to this question, of course. But what we argue is that it's much easier for Justin Trudeau to go to a Muslim meeting in Canada and say salam alaikum to everyone and talk about the hijab and say that people should be free, women should be free to wear hijabs than for Macron to potentially do the same thing. So it is, I think the whole question about Canada being a settler state with a form of colonialism that is really at-home colonialism, right? I think is quite strong. And we have tried in some way to ask our interviewees questions about this. Again, for reasons having to do with the fact that the book is not super big, we have barely any space for this, but there were quite a few questions and answers that were interesting. Of course, this is very in your face in other parts of the world, right? In Dubai, in Qatar, as the Nepalese or Bangladeshi workers were building stadiums, and many of them were dying. So quite a few of our interviewees they shared feelings of embarrassment and saying, oh yeah, it's horrible what happens to them. And by saying this, of course, they were realizing the extent to which, as highly educated people, as bearers of French passports, they felt, of course, outside of all this. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's for the record, there are a couple of Canadian colleagues, so their names are Jennifer Selby.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I was on a roundtable.
Okay, cool. So Jennifer Selby and Amélie Barras, who is based at Toronto, they have a podcast called Secularism on the Move, right? So if you can check it out, right? It's Secularism on the Move. It's about it illuminates some of the discussion we've been having about secularism in Canada and in France. It's really about French people living in Canada, whether Muslim or not.
Thank you. I think I'll collect all the remaining questions and let you answer them.
Okay.
Collectively. So I know you want to ask a question, Margaret, and you do, and John, you do. So we'll take the three together. So you go first, Margaret.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation and the insights. I just wanted to find out from you whether the research team looked at the high importance they attach to the identities. For instance, those of them that say they don't want to return back to France, did you try to find out, would they also want to return to their other identity like Algeria?
So Margaret's your name. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So Margaret, I think we have realized that those that live, if we bring together data about their level of education and where they live, by and large, those that have so-called returned to Algeria, right? They were born in France, the vast majority of them. So there's no such thing as a return to Algeria. But those of them that have, as it were, returned to Algeria, Morocco, or Turkey. Turkey is also a country that needs to be taken into account. Are much more likely to be less highly qualified than those who have gone to Canada or the UK. So I think there's an element of how qualified they are, and a lot of them are like globetrotters. Quite a few of them are like globetrotters in the sense that they like this guy that I mentioned who is a teacher. Lived around Birmingham for a few years and then now apparently lives in Dubai. I think generally they tend not to go to North Africa. And again, this is corroborated by the places of residence. Not many of them actually go to Algeria, Morocco, or Tunisia or Turkey. But I think among these four countries, the most massively chosen place of residence is Morocco, clearly, right? The job market is considered as different from the Algerian job market. It's considered as a much more sort of westernized kind of place, and you don't get the sense of, you know, post-colonial guilt around, you know, the war in Algeria. You know, it's much more sort of pacified. And anyone is from Morocco here? No? Okay. Moroccans have a word which is smagri, which apparently refers to, there is a deep sense, there is a profound sense of a Moroccan diaspora across the world, right? So if you are from Morocco, you go and live in Canada for 5 years, and then if you return to Morocco, you are considered as Moroccan. I think for Algeria, it's not that clear, I think.
About like the identity.
Yeah.
I think it's very similar.
Okay.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Merci pour la présentation. I was just going to talk about the fact that I listened to this episode of France Inter, which is like French NPR, or BBC sounds, I guess. And it was about this concept of insécurité linguistique, so linguistic insecurity, and the fact that many people, and this isn't just necessarily about class, but there is this sort of hostility against any sort of deviation in how the French language should be. There's an idea of what good French sounds like. I guess in England, Queen's English, but I mean, well, the King's, but
that's a very good question.
Exactly, but the point is that, and then the more I thought about this, the more I could see it with the concept of debates with the Académie Française trying to raise language that obviously has gone far past France's borders. And I guess I was wondering if, because I have felt this myself, not even on a class sense, but just because my dad is as French as it gets, but my mom is Filipino, and just from her English, my French sounds just a little bit weird. And it's even just that little bit of weirdness has like definitely changed how I've been perceived when I talk to people. And so I'm wondering if France is exceptional in this sort of linguistic conservatism, this hostility, this idea that French needs to be spoken perfectly, especially if you want to accede to sort of roles that would only be accessible through higher education. Yeah. And whether this came out in people's interviews, if anyone said that beyond even myself being a Muslim, not being accepted for my religion, my French just didn't meet standards. Whereas in, even if their French was technically perfect, perfectly francophone, in a way that in other countries this wouldn't reveal itself.
Yeah, so it's
We'll take John's question.
Sorry.
You know, I'll just take a pass. You know, I'll get you outside over a glass of wine.
Okay, so but I mean we can you can ask it here again. I have plenty of time, but I don't take decisions. I only answer questions. It's a very good question. I think it's only obliquely related to what we're discussing, but I think it is an important question. At some point in the 18th century, I think there was talk about the creation of an academy of English, of the English language, with, was it Samuel Johnson, or I don't even know whether Samuel Johnson is the 18th century. Shame on me.
He is 18th.
Okay, so thanks a lot. I was only testing you. I knew. Okay, I'm impressed. And so some of these guys, including Samuel Johnson, they would say, yeah, we need to create an academy of English so that people, blah, blah, blah. They never did it, and I think it's a very good thing. Indeed, much of the French standard that should be spoken indeed is decided upon by the Académie Française, which, for the record, doesn't include any linguists. So those that are the scientists of language, of the French language, are not even part of it, because linguistics as a discipline was actually created after the birth of the French Academy. So it's about vocabulary, it's about grammar, syntax, and it's about accent. The woman that I mentioned, who she lives in London now. She worked for the BBC. She worked for plenty of cultural institutions and stuff. She is the one who said to us, I was wearing a skirt, I was drinking wine, I was integrated. And so the very same people will tell her, when you speak French, you don't have an accent. You don't have a sort of a banlieue accent, which is really looked down upon. So I think in all, clearly, and despite the absence of an English academy, clearly certain forms of accents are also looked down upon, despite the fact that now, BBC English, RP, reciprocation isn't the norm anymore. So that's a good thing. But interestingly, illustrate the extent to which these issues are, on dirait hystérisés en fait en français, okay. I was interviewed with, not with France Inter, but with France Culture, which now has become very popular. So it's supposed to be the sort of highbrow version of France Inter. In the morning, I mentioned this interview with this guy, from the Comoros, who said, wesh s'abuser in Montréal. And it was one of the few times, I suppose, when that phrase was spoken on France Culture. And then my press agent, right, at Le Seuil, she was quite angry. She said, well, you don't say this on France Culture. And I think her point was interesting because I disagreed with it. I have a very inclusive, approach of the French language. I think it should be Georges Brassens is my linguistic model. You should say turiféraire. You should use plenty of fancy words, and at the same time say putain, merde. Use all the words that are possible to be used. And so when our press agent was quite angry, she was also right, because I certainly didn't want to speak like the spokesperson of the people that we talked to. It was only one or two people that said wesh c'est abusé, but clearly others would rather publicly use very respectable form of French language. So in a way, I was not being faithful to the substantial number of them who clearly publicly would make a tremendous effort to use very a very sort of elaborate kind of vocabulary, I think. Je suis pas sûr d'avoir tout le monde, mais on va en reparler après parce there's a Mediapart video which is about that thing with l'Académie française, and it's a Marseille guy. It's a Marseille-based linguist that does it, and he's very good.
Well, thank you very much, Olivier, and everybody, for a very interesting seminar. As you can see, there are some copies of the book here.
Oh, yeah.
If you want to have a look at it, and I believe actually you can buy one here if you want, and get it autographed by one of the authors. But in any case, we'd very much like you to join us for a drink outside, where of course you can continue further conversations with each other, as well as with Professor Olivier Esteves.
You can ask me your question. Thanks a lot, okay? Thanks a lot. It was
very much
enjoyable.
Thank you.
Ouais, alors c'est le...
Alors, France,